Alright guys, it's Teaser back with another video. I decided to make one to showcase how to solder for the Pico Defuse, which is used for diagnosing and repairing Wii U's. So these are the first points that you have to solder. So TP48 is on the left side and TP52 is on the right side. It's those gold contact pads that I have flux on. They're all in line. They all line up. We have to solder a line to each one of these. A couple things about soldering. I'm going to use a microscope to do this to showcase in the video. That being said, you could certainly do this with the naked eye. The wire that you should be using is 38 gauge enameled wire, or at least that's the wire I recommend. You can use any wire that you're comfortable with. You want small wire that doesn't have the possibility of shorting on a component or a trace on the board after you tuck these wires where they need to go in order to get the board back in the console. So here what you're seeing me do is just dab a little bit of solder onto the end of the enameled wire, and you got to hold this here a little bit, and I'm doing this under the camera so you can see that it does take a few seconds and a few tries to burn this enamel off. It can be done a lot easier if you just put it on a silicone mat and hold the soldering iron on top of it, which is probably what I'm doing right here off camera. But once you get that done, you can get this to stick very effortlessly to the first pad, and then we'll just move on and do all the other pads in line with this one. So right now you don't have to keep track of where these wires go. We can focus on that later. We just need a wire on each one of these points, which is TP48 through TP55. One of the things I didn't do here, which you should probably do, which will make this a lot easier, is pre-tin all these pads with some solder. You don't need to put a whole lot, you just need a thin layer, and that'll make the solder flow to it a lot easier with flux. For some reason I didn't do that before doing this video. Oftentimes when I'm recording I forget to do simple things because I'm trying to make sure that the video is good enough that it can be viewed in good detail. But yeah, you should pre-tin these. They'll go on a lot easier. I mean, you could certainly work through this like I'm working through. It just takes a little bit longer. And just so everyone knows, this video is in real time. So the 28 minutes is what it took me to solder this while recording. So I would imagine if you're not recording and you're just looking at the schematic, or you've watched this video and you want to sit down and you want to do the soldering, you could probably bang it out in about 10 or 15 minutes. Something that I did ahead of time is I counted out a total of 8 enameled wire strands, and I measured them 26 centimeters long. This gives me enough length that I can attach it to the Raspberry Pi Pico and fold it around the printed circuit board, following where the antenna wires go, and bring it onto the front where I can secure it if I have to. This allows me to put the back plate and heatsink back on the board for testing purposes. It's probably not necessary entirely, and you could obviously do this a different way, but that's the way I chose to do it. So right here you see that I wisened up and said, hey, what am I doing? Pre-tin these pads, this will go on a lot easier. And you'll see here in this video that putting a little bit of solder on these pads ahead of time makes these wires stick a lot quicker. It makes it just a lot easier to get that solder to flow onto the wire and then onto the pad. Once you're done soldering the wires in place, you can choose to either clean this up or not clean it up. I usually clean it up because I like to inspect the joints and make sure that there's enough solder holding it in place. These wires are very brittle though, so you're not going to be able to go in here and just beat the heck out of them. I'm just dabbing this Q-tip with IPA on it, and then I am going to try and use a toothbrush, but you don't have to clean it up perfectly. You could also spray this area down with a solvent that cleans up solder if you have that. It's not something that I really use, so I'm just going to use a toothbrush with some IPA and just be gentle with the wires so you don't break them off and have to resolder them. Once you're done with those first 8 points soldering and cleaning it up, we can go ahead and we can move on to the next section of the board that requires 2 wires. So here's the next section of the board. We need 2 wires, one attached to each one of these pads right here. And just give me a second, I gotta grab my my pointy stick. I think it's a dental pick actually. This pad and this pad is what we need. So I'll show that again. It's those 2 pads where I'm putting the flux. Alright, so I'm just going to pre-tin these 2 pads because attaching a wire to pre-tin pads is a heck of a lot easier than trying to tin the pad and the wire at the same time. So there we go, pre-tinned, easy peasy. So once they're tinned, just go ahead and grab your wire and bring it on over and throw a blob of solder on it. And there we go, first wire is installed. Now we can move on to the second wire. And most of this video is going to be much of the same thing. It's just soldering these wires over and over to these points on the Wii U board. You know, and sometimes they're a little tricky. These wires are tiny. There we go, that's in place. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up, and then we're going to move on to the next section of the board. The next pad that we need to get a line connected to is TP144, and I will show where that is with my dental pick right here. It's this pad. So go ahead and grab your wire and solder a wire to this pad, and then we're going to move on to the next section. Alright, so over here, this is the last section of the board that you need 2 wires. And you need them on 2 separate pads. You need it on this pad right here and this pad right here. So go ahead and throw some flux on there, tin the pads, and get your wire attached. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I won't bore you guys with talking about it, but I am going to mention this one thing. While you're doing this, you could choose to throw some Kapton tape around these wires to prevent them from making contact with the board. I do that in this video. I just waited to do it at the end. You could obviously do it after soldering the wires in each section of the board. That way you don't have to go back later and do it. I just wanted to clarify that the point that we're soldering a wire to is TP176 and then TP, I think it's 101. Alright, and we're going to get the second wire in place here. Again, I'm just going to clean this section of the board up and then we can move on. Alright, so this is where I start adding the Kapton tape. Like I said, you don't have to wait till the end to do this, but I did. So all I'm doing is I'm slipping this Kapton tape underneath the wires, and then I'm sticking it to the board just to make sure that the close to the ends of the wires can't make contact with a via or anything else. So that's what you're going to see me do. I'm just backtracking here. Oh, I apparently didn't clean this off, so let me clean that off right now. And then we'll get some Kapton tape on this one as well. And it's just to insulate the wire so that there's no chance of it leaking voltage or amperage to these vias or other components. A couple of these points are around high amperage, I believe, rails that go to the GPU. So you don't want to have a short happening with one of these wires. You're going to draw amperage and voltage someplace it shouldn't go, and which will likely result in damaging the board, and it probably won't be repairable. So just throw on some Kapton tape, protect yourself, insulate these wires, and go from there. So the section with the most wires, which is 8 of them, you definitely want to put some Kapton tape to insulate these. And what I decided to do is put Kapton tape over the left side and then separate the right side from those. So you're going to see me fold these towards the right to get them out of the way. These wires are delicate, but they're not delicate enough that you can't move them around or fold them to get them in place. You just can't bend them back and forth with any type of force because they'll just snap off the board. That's what 38 gauge wire is. Very thin, very weak. Something to keep in mind when you're doing this is you want to make sure that these wires are separated enough that you can easily identify them, because you're going to have to know which wire goes to which pin when you go to attach these to the Raspberry Pi Pico. So just keep that in mind. If you bunch all these together and you can't tell which pin they go to, you're likely going to run into some trouble. Alright, so once you're done putting your Kapton tape in place on those wires that you soldered, we're going to move over to the Raspberry Pi Pico and just get all the pads ready that we need to use with these wires. You could obviously do this a different way, but I think this is the easier way to do it. Just pre-tin every pad that you're going to use. That way you know which pads are being used and which ones aren't. There's no reason to tin the ones you're not going to use, but if you want to do that, you certainly can. Alright, so here's an image, and I would recommend pausing this video and looking at this. So this shows you every pin on the Raspberry Pi Pico that needs to have solder on it. Additionally, it shows you the 4 pins, 4 on the left side as well as 4 on the right side, that have to be bridged together. I used an enamel wire to do this. You can use solder blobs, a wire, whatever it takes to get done, but they have to be connected together. When you get done pre-tinning all the pins, your Raspberry Pi Pico should look exactly like mine does in this video. So now we're going to move on to me actually doing that. If you guys don't want to see that, look down in the description. You can just skip this whole section of the video and move on. Before we actually move on and show me doing that, this is the diagram that shows where all these wires have to be connected on the Raspberry Pi Pico. I borrowed this from the GitHub page, which was provided by Jade Strike, so thank you for the image. I recommend you guys reference this. The link is in the description to the GitHub page where this picture is available to view. That being said, let's get into actually soldering the points on the Raspberry Pi Pico. So right here, what you see is enamel wire, and I'm putting flux on it because what I want to do is burn all of this enamel off. The more flux you have, the easier it is to remove the enamel because the flux cleans the soldering iron and enamel away from the copper wire. So this is how I clean these in order to bridge the 4 pins on the Raspberry Pi Pico, and it's how I would recommend you do it. The other thing that can make this easier to do is if you have a big solder blob on the end of your iron, which you see right here. I have this big blob, and you coat that entire copper wire in solder before you move it to the pins on the Raspberry Pi Pico to solder in place. If it's already pre-coated with solder, which you're going to see right here, it just goes in way easier. So again, flux is your friend, so don't forget to use it. It makes life a heck of a lot easier. And you'll see that these, as soon as I get this first point in and it sticks, the rest of them are just, they're one and done. So see, very easy. Pre-10, and then what you can do is just bend this back and forth because this wire is so thin and it'll just break at the last solder point. Alright, the remainder of this video is just me pre-tinning all the pads that the Raspberry Pi Pico has to be hooked up. You're more than welcome to watch this. If you need some clarification, I'm sure the video will provide it. I'm not going to be talking and describing what I'm doing because I think I've already explained it enough in the previous pictures that I showed what needs to be done. But you can see the full process if you'd like. If you're not interested in seeing the full process, you can just skip to the end of the video and hear my conclusion here. All right, so that's the end of tinning the Raspberry Pi Pico. Now all you have to do is follow the diagram that's in the description and connect the wires from the Nintendo Wii PCB to the Raspberry Pi Pico where they need to go. I initially planned on doing this in the video, but my camera simply isn't strong enough to pick up the tiny 38 gauge wires, and after playing around with it for probably several hours, I decided to just forego doing that and just leave this explanation in the video so that people understand. I don't think you guys need a demonstration of it at this point. I showed where to solder on the Wii U. I showed the soldering points on the Raspberry Pi Pico and what it should look like when you're done. So you ought to be able to look at the diagram and follow it precisely and connect those wires appropriately. That being said, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys around.